Hello and welcome back. We've now covered sections A through F of Chapter 6. What we've done is learn how to organize a categorical syllogism so that it is in standard form, identify its mood and figure, and test it for validity using two techniques under the modern and traditional interpretations. Now we move on to look at ordinary language arguments, as well as incomplete arguments and arguments with too many terms. Let's get started. Okay, so we're going to focus first on how we can organize an ordinary language argument by reducing the number of terms. So what we want to end up with, as you know, is an argument that has three statements or three propositions, two premises and a conclusion. Each of the terms has to be consistent. In other words, if you have, let's say, the class of dignified things in one of your sentences, and in another sentence you have the class of undignified things, you need to make sure that you reorganize your argument so that your classes are consistent with each other. Otherwise, you'll end up with too many terms. So sometimes you will use your immediate inferences to help you make sure that your terms are consistent. You might use conversion, you might use obversion, or you might use contraposition. In addition, think about what you studied in Chapter 5 with respect to translating ordinary language sentences into standard form for the categorical proposition. So, for example, the sentence, if there are dogs, then they bark, becomes all dogs bark. Use those existing skills as you work your way through Section G of Chapter 6. So let's take a look at how this works in an ordinary language argument. In blue, you see the following. Drug tests shouldn't be used. Of course, if something is reliable, then it should be used. But unfortunately, drug tests aren't reliable. What's the conclusion? Think about inferential flow. If you plug a therefore in front of each of the sentences, you should find that the first sentence, drug tests shouldn't be used, you should find that it reflects the most intuitive, if you will, inferential flow. Now, look at the way the argument has been reorganized and restated. We're focusing on the reorganization and restatement of each proposition. And then we look at how we can organize the argument so that it reflects standard form. So if we have as the conclusion, drug tests shouldn't be used, when we organize that and restate it in standard form for the categorical proposition, we get no drug tests are things that should be used. Remember, we have the class of drug tests and the class of things that should be used. Once we know what our conclusion is, we can see that drug tests is the minor term and things that should be used is the major term. Notice also when we take the major term, things that should be used, and we find it in its corresponding premise, we see the second sentence of the original argument is the major premise. If something is reliable, then it should be used. Go back to your Chapter 5 skill set, and you'll know that that sentence becomes, all reliable things are things that should be used. Lastly, drug tests aren't reliable becomes no drug tests are reliable things. Notice that now we've got our terms both linguistically and conceptually identical. We've got, in order of appearance, reliable things, things that should be used, and drug tests. Now, if we abstract away from the content, we get all RRT, no DRR, and no DRT. R is the middle term. It's the term that's repeated in the premises. It is distributed not just once, but twice, so it meets rule number 1, or the argument satisfies rule number 1. Rule number 2, however, is a problem. Notice that T is distributed in the conclusion, but not in its corresponding premise. Hence, the argument is invalid. It violates rule number 2. It is a fallacy of what's called illicit major. Let's take a look at another example. This time, let's focus on acceptive propositions. Everyone except those under 18 years of age is eligible to vote. My brother John is older than 18, so he can vote. Recall that acceptive propositions require 2 translations, so you'll end up with 2 syllogisms. Everyone except those under 18 years of age is eligible to vote. That means all people over 18 years of age are eligible to vote, and no people under 18 years of age are eligible to vote. Notice what we get in the first proposition, the major premise of each argument. No under age 18 are eligible to vote, and all non-under age 18 are eligible to vote. The second premise is my brother John is older than age 18. In other words, all persons identical to my brother John are non-under age 18. So, all people identical to my brother John are eligible to vote. In the invalid version of the argument, the second premise reads, no one identical with John is under the age of 18. Notice that it's consistent, the U is consistent in each of the premises in which it appears, both in the first argument that turns out to be invalid and the second argument that turns out to be valid. So let's take a look at these in turn. No one under age 18 is eligible to vote. No persons identical to John are under the age of 18. So, all persons identical with John are eligible to vote. You probably already know that this argument violates rule number 3. You can't have 2 negative premises. Now let's take a look at the second argument, the one that's valid. All non-U are E, all J are non-U, so all J are E. Notice that the middle term, non-U, is distributed in the first premise. The minor term is distributed in its premise because it's distributed in the conclusion. It must also be distributed in its corresponding premise. And then none of the remainder of the 4 rules are applicable. We don't have 2 negative premises. We don't have a negative premise and a negative conclusion and vice versa. And we don't have 2 universal premises and a particular conclusion. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at another argument. Once again, we want to reorganize the argument, restate each one of the propositions so that the propositions and the argument are all, the propositions and the argument both are in standard form. Whenever I take my umbrella, the weather stays sunny. I didn't take my umbrella, so it's going to rain. U becomes times I take my umbrella. R is times when it rains, T times identical to today. So we get all U are non-are. So whenever I take my umbrella with me, the weather stays sunny, which is to say it's non-rainy. Why do we have to translate weather stays sunny to non-are? Well, notice that the conclusion is it's going to rain. So we need to have the class of rainy days or weather that's rainy be consistent from the conclusion to the premise in which it appears implicitly. So all U are non-are. I didn't take my umbrella with me today, so we have all times that are today are times I didn't take my umbrella. And then lastly, it's going to rain. It's going to rain means, given the previous sentence, it's going to rain today. So all times that are identical today are times that are going to rain. Notice also that we have to take the U and the non-U from respectively the first and the second premise, the major and the minor premise, and we've got to contrapose the proposition. So what we end up with is all are non-U. Remember, the contrapositive of the original claim converts the subject and the predicate position and adds the complement to each. Since there's already a complement in front of are, the double negative is removed. All right, now let's look at our rules. Rule number 1. All right, so notice that the middle term, non-U, is not distributed in either the major or the minor premise. So the argument violates rule number 1. If you take a look at the Venn diagram, you'll see also that the conclusion, all T are R, does not appear when we diagram the premises, all R are non-U and all T are non-U. Now let's take a look at arguments that are incomplete. You've already seen these in Chapter 1. The goal here is to supply the missing premise or conclusion. More specifically, you want to complete the argument so that it is valid. Take a look at the following example. People who go slow in the fast lane are boorish, so anyone who goes slow in the fast lane is selfish. What's the conclusion? Anyone who goes slow in the fast lane is selfish. Let's go ahead and organize what we have accordingly. The conclusion is all G, that is, people who go slow in the fast lane, are S, that is, selfish people. The first premise, then, is people who go slow in the fast lane are boorish. Now, when you translate that, you end up with all G are B. That is, all people who go slow in the fast lane are boorish people. Notice that though this is the first premise that appears in the argument, well, it's the only premise that appears in the argument, it's not the major premise. Why? Because the conclusion is all G are S, so G is the minor term. The minor term appears in the minor premise, which goes second in the order. What do we need to do in order to complete this argument? We need the major premise. If all people who go slow in the fast lane are boorish, and it follows, therefore, that everybody who goes slow in the fast lane is selfish, that means that all boorish people are selfish is the major premise. You'll notice that this argument satisfies all 6 rules, and when you diagram the premises, all B are S, all G are B, the conclusion appears. That is, whatever G's there are, they're all dumped into the S class. Notice that we did not assume existential import. This argument was diagrammed according to the modern interpretation. but it would be valid on either. All right, let's go ahead and work on this incomplete argument. I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong. Let's make sure we know what we're talking about. I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they, the segregation ordinances, are morally wrong. Notice that the indicator word for tells us that what's come just before it is the conclusion, which means that a premise is segregation ordinances are morally wrong. So let's start with the sentence we just worked on. They, that is, segregation ordinances, are morally wrong. It's a linguistically simpler sentence for us to work with, and I hope it's clear that the translation goes as follows. All segregation ordinances are morally wrong laws, or morally wrong things. The conclusion, I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, is a little bit trickier. The sense seems to be this, that segregation ordinances are to be disobeyed. So it seems reasonable to translate the sentence as follows. All segregation ordinances are laws to be disobeyed, are laws that should be disobeyed. So now we have a premise and a conclusion. All segregation ordinances are morally wrong laws. And the conclusion, all segregation ordinances are laws that should be disobeyed. What's missing? What's missing is laws that are morally wrong should be disobeyed. Let's see how this plays out. All morally wrong laws are laws that should be disobeyed. All segregation ordinances are morally wrong laws. So, all segregation ordinances are laws that should be disobeyed. We can eliminate the wordiness, a sort of visual clutter, and get all M are D, all S are M, all S are D. The mood is AAA, the figure is 1, and that valid argument form is always valid. We can also think in terms of the rules of the syllogism. All 6 rules are satisfied on both, well, we know that the 6th rule is the only one that matters for the modern interpretation versus the traditional, but on both interpretations, all 6 rules are satisfied. All right, let's move on to our last section in Chapter 6, Section I, which covers sorties or heaping arguments. These are arguments where there are too many terms for a standard form categorical syllogism. So our job is to make sure that we complete one argument that's implied in the original argument so that we can then use the conclusion as a premise, specifically the major premise, for the second argument. So take a look at the argument in blue on the far left. We have D, C, A, and S in our argument. That means that we have 2 more classes of thing, 2 more terms than is required for the standard form categorical syllogism. So, and I say standard form, but I mean any categorical syllogism should have only 3 terms or 3 classes, right? So here we have 5. So what we're going to want to do is look at the conclusion, which in this case is all SRC. We're going to find in the premises the major term. That is going to be our major premise. And then the next premise is going to be the minor premise. We will draw an inference from that, which is the intermediate conclusion. And if the argument is valid, we continue on to use that intermediate conclusion as the major premise in the last stage of the argument, where we work with the final premise of the original argument. So all D are C, all A are D yields all A are C. All A are C then becomes the major premise for the next argument, whose minor premise is all S are A. So in the first argument, all 6 rules are satisfied. And in the second argument, again, all 6 rules are satisfied. Let's practice. Some G are non-H, no E are non-G, so some E are not H. What we're going to want to do is obvert the first premise so that it matches the conclusion's predicate term. We're also going to want to obvert the second premise, the minor premise, so that the term G and non-G will match. Here's what we get. Some G are not H, all E are G, and some E are not H. The argument is not, however, valid. It violates rule number 1. Notice that G is not distributed. Here is the Venn diagram that also reflects visually the argument's invalidity. Notice that the minor premise, all E are G, is diagrammed, and the major premise, some G are not H, is diagrammed. The X straddling the line tells us that it's unclear whether or not the G that is not an H may or may not also be an E. Since the conclusion says some E are not H, and we're not sure whether or not the X does in fact fall inside the E category or the E circle, the argument is invalid. Let's try one more. This is a little bit trickier. The conclusion is some G are non-E. You can see that E appears in the second premise. That's going to need to go first. In addition, we're going to need to make sure that the E and the non-E are reconciled. In addition, notice that in the first and the second premise, J and non-J need to be reconciled. Lastly, non-K and K in the first and third premises also need to be reconciled. Let's see how this works. We get an obversion of the first premise. We get an obversion of the second premise. And the third premise remains the same. Lastly, the conclusion is obverted. Now, notice that what we didn't do was flip the first and second premises order. That's because we either can Venn diagram, in which case the standard form is not essential, or we just bear in mind that we know that the major premise is all E are J. All right, so when we take the first 2 premises, once they've both been obverted, we get the following. No J are K, all E are J, so no E are K. We have a valid argument. None of the 6 rules are broken. No ERK becomes our major premise now for our for our second argument. No ERK, some GRK, some G are not E. Rule number 1. All right, so we can see here again that no rule has been broken. The middle term, K, is distributed at least once, namely in the major premise. E, the major term, is distributed in the conclusion and in its corresponding premise. It's not the case that there are two negative premises. It is the case that there is one negative premise and one negative conclusion, and vice versa. And then lastly, we don't have a case in which we have two universal premises that, on the modern interpretation at least, require a universal conclusion. All right, we've covered a lot. I hope you'll take some time to go back into Chapter 5, I believe it's Section G if I'm not mistaken, that focuses on translations from ordinary language into standard form for the categorical proposition. You may also decide to revisit the section of Chapter 1 that covers enthymemes. But if not, make sure that you understand what you're being asked to do when you have an incomplete argument. You need to complete the argument by supplying the missing premise or conclusion that would make the argument valid. Then lastly, when you have an argument with more than 3 classes of thing or more than 3 terms, you need to reduce the number of terms in order to test the argument for validity.